Welcome to the maiden voyage of the Man in the Arena podcast. My name is Jonah Schultz, and I'll be your host as we venture on this crusade of truth together. The name of this show was chosen very intentionally. You may recognize it as the title from the famous speech given by Teddy Roosevelt in 1910. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. I chose this name because each and every one of us is now that man in the arena, whether you like it or not. All of us have today at least partially lived in a time of relative peace and prosperity that is really unrivaled in the history of humanity. Never before has a society or a nation maintained the peace and economic success or the cultural dominance that the United States of America has over the last 75 years. But that time is now over. Our once dominant economy now hinges upon the whims of a few behemoth corporations and really disregards the well-being of our people who now struggle to find a home or to put food on their table. Our once vibrant communities have sunk into depression and chaos while foreign hordes flood across our borders. And our once beautiful culture has devolved into unmitigated depravity while our children are growing up in broken homes in a corrupt education system. And our once respected citizens, our once revered people, are now viewed as nothing more than a tax farm for the globalist elite to fund their wars and their initiatives thousands of miles from our shores. But it didn't have to be this way. Yet, here we stand. This is why now you and I are both the man in the arena. The survival of liberty in the United States of America now hinges upon what we decide to do with our remaining years on this earth. We must make a choice to throw off the shackles of globalism and moral relativism and embrace a culture of truth and virtue that finally puts our American people first. The man in the arena is now all that stands between our children and a life of servitude. Now, you can find this podcast wherever you find your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Pocket Cast, Castro, Good Pods, and more. Make sure you check us out on social media, on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. Look for at Man in the Arena PC. And make sure you subscribe on YouTube. That's the only place that you can find our video podcast. This show will be dedicated to pursuing the truth and exploring the root causes of our American decline. My goal is that we will discuss many hard truths and many uncomfortable subjects that will lead us to understand what actions must be taken to save our republic. I don't claim to have all the answers like you. I have many, many questions on how we get out of this mess. But what I do know is that we were all put here for a purpose. You have a purpose and a mission here on this earth that no other human being can accomplish. And I believe that we have been put in this moment for a reason. We could have been born at any other time, in any other place, but we weren't. We were put right here, right now, to face these obstacles, both in your own life and as a nation. So buckle up. We've got a country to save. This is the Man in the Arena.
Tear down this wall. what you can do for your country.
Welcome to The Man in the Arena. I'm Jonah Schultz. I'm here on my panel today with Ken Hendrickson Jr., and we are now going to get into our calibration. All right, Ken, I think we need to kick this out, get hot right out of the gate. I think we need to get controversial right out of the gate. What do you think?
Controversy is my middle name.
Gotcha.
So.
I think that this segment here, this portion of this discussion here really is something that needs to be had because we're so tense as a society about talking about this. And if you've been following the news recently, you might have heard of you might have seen the news article that Adolf Hitler speeches are going viral on TikTok. Now, before you turn this off, I'm not getting into a defense of Hitler. I'm not getting into promotion of Hitler. So please don't feel that that's the direction that we're going in right now. But there was an article that came out recently, and I thought it was pretty fascinating. It was on the New York Post. Hitler's AI translated speeches go viral on TikTok with one video topping 1 million views in a troubling trend. Now, I actually, before this even came about, I was scrolling on Twitter, on X, and I came across an AI translated video, and I actually stopped to watch it, not because I am a big Hitler proponent, but because I was just interested. I had never actually seen.
So you're not a white supremacist?
No.
Now?
Let's get that out of the way. I'm not a white supremacist, although I'm sure I'll be called one. But I stopped because I had never seen that before. And I thought, why is this happening? Number one, why is this happening that in my 30 years of life I've never seen or heard read a transcript of a Hitler speech, and all of a sudden they're blowing up on social media. And then the question that came up is, TikTok ultimately wound up taking these down. So why take it down? Those were kind of the first two questions that I had, because you have speeches that you can access on. You can listen to Stalin, you can listen to Mao, but Hitler is the one person that you're not allowed to listen to. And those two individuals, they killed a lot more people than Hitler. We don't like to talk about it because communism is obviously growing in popularity. But my big question was, why is this happening? Is this people just being interested? I find that hard to believe from an educational standpoint, because if you're somebody like me, I stopped to watch it because I'm just kind of interested. I'm kind of interested in learning what's the context around here. What was he actually saying? Because you just hear, you see a lot of clips of black and white of him just kind of screaming.
Yeah, right.
Most people don't speak German. I don't speak German. So I have no idea what the context of the situation is. So I stopped because I was interested to see from a historical context. But why is this happening now? Why is this trend really growing? And it made me start to really think. And what I really came to the conclusion of is people are really growing desperate right now. There's a desperation among certainly my generation, of the millennial generation, and now leaking into Gen Z, where people know there is something deeply, deeply wrong. Something is going really astray in our economy, in our culture, obviously in our government. And we look at the people who are supposed to be our revered, respected leaders, and if you're somebody like me, you view them as people that cannot be trusted, right? Of people that are probably going to tell you the exact opposite of the truth. So when those people tell you over and over that Hitler is the worst person that's ever lived, I think it's actually sparking an interest for people, because they're saying, well, if these people are saying he's so bad, maybe they're actually wrong. And I think that's where some danger starts creeping in, on where people start getting led astray. And I don't know if you came across these videos before this really became anything, or if I was one of the few that were targeted by the Twitter algorithm.
Yeah, and I mean, not organically, I did not come across them, but once the story started to run, I did investigate quite a bit. And I mean, I think there's very much two sides to this, right? Because I think personally, I'm kind of in the same boat as you, where it's like, if I were to see this, I'm actually interested, because I think there's a really strong educational component to this, which is, how did someone veil pure evil as for the general welfare? Understanding how politicians talk, how they can make something awful seem good and get millions of people to follow. I think that's important. We have to, as a society, understand that you have to listen to what's being said because it's easy to manipulate the masses. And like those are lessons that like our children need to learn. And then the second half of that is you see some of these that are kind of selectively edited to make Hitler sound mainstream,
more appealing.
Populist. Yeah. And that's where the danger lies because now you see some of the comments on these videos and it's like yay Hitler. Like, that's the danger side. Like I'm kind of on the fence of like, did you censor this stuff? Like, I'm never really in favor of censoring anything because I do think that it's important for that stuff to be out there. Like you said, you can read transcripts and see speeches from other historical figures, and Hitler was unfortunately one of them.
Yeah. He's one of the most prominent historical figures in world history. So you would think from a educational standpoint, he's an important person to learn about the context of what allowed him to draw such popularity, right? Because, like you said, if you don't understand the history and what created this environment, then you're doomed to repeat it, right? How many philosophers over the course of history have said something along those lines? It's a tale as old as time.
Yeah, but I think that danger is where that desperation creeps in.
Yeah.
Because then you have people that are looking for answers maybe in the wrong places.
Yeah. Yeah, and that kind of led me to what the deeper question was and what it's always been, because we've obviously, I think in our education system today in the United States, unfortunately, I could certainly speak for the public school system and even myself going up in different private schools, is that the main focus of our history classes was World War II. Like, that's the most prominent historical event that anybody in our age range has any kind of understanding of, or they think they have some sort of understanding of it. So obviously the focus is Hitler being one of the most well-known figures. There was always this boiling question that I've had with many people is, how do you even get a Hitler? How does somebody like that, and like many of these prominent autocrats throughout history, how do they gain that type of power, that type of following, that type of popularity? And it was always so baffling that so many people, millions and millions and millions of people, could get behind these causes that were so awful, that could get behind atrocities, yet we see it again and again throughout history. And it always gets back every time I look at this, it does get back to that desperation, because you look at the Weimar Republic, you look at the development of Hitler as a young man, right? You're growing up in a nation. Let's say you could put this to yourself, look at your own life and here in the United States. Germany was a nation that lost a war and was punished at a level that had never been seen before. And the people starving to death, seeing a cultural depravity in the form of prostitution and kind of the sexual depravity that went on there at a rate that had really never been seen before in the Western world taking place, and being so oppressed militarily, and really feeling like, hey, we're Germans, we're honorable people, we're a strong people, why are we being oppressed in this way? People will turn to anyone that they feel can get them out of that situation when their backs are up against the wall. And that's what I feel is the scary position that we find ourselves in now, is people are increasingly finding themselves feeling like they're running out of answers, and that they're looking for somebody who, whether it's one man or a group of people, can do whatever it takes to get them out of this situation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've always said that about politicians. I mean, I think people look to politicians as kind of these one-stop shops for fixing everything, when in reality, the solutions probably lie within our own communities and within ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think even with like the Hitler videos, right? Like the key to understanding and education here is like, what have mom and dad taught you at home? Like, what are your values? Like, do you understand? It's so easy to fall in love with the way something is said instead of what is actually being said.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think also the threat that we're seeing growing here is, obviously Hitler is now, he's a catch-all for anybody that we don't like, right? If we don't like this politician, he's Hitler. Yeah. Donald Trump takes a drink of water. You know else who drank water? Hitler. Hitler drank water. So you look at what's specifically going on with Donald Trump, right? You see the assassination attempts, you see the threats on his life, you see the political violence that's been growing. And you've seen him now for 8 years being called Hitler, being compared to Hitler, being called a dictator, being called a threat to democracy. And I think what's actually kind of going on here, and the danger of that, is not just the danger it poses to political rivals like Donald Trump to the establishment or to the left at large, I think it's going to create almost what they fear, right? I think this, turning up to 11 on the Hitler talk is actually, because Donald Trump is on most issues is more of a moderate.
It's very populist.
He's not extreme on any of the social issues. He's not really extreme on any of the issues. He's really, his whole platform is, let's just stop the flow of illegal immigration. Let's prioritize American businesses. That's really, if you look at his platform, that's the bulk of it. That's 90% of what he stands for. And he's against some of the extreme social elements of the left. But other than that, there's nothing Adolf Hitlerish about Donald Trump. There's nothing extreme social about Donald Trump. So I guess what we're seeing here is a lot of radical individuals being born out of this feeling like they're going after Donald Trump like this. We need something even stronger. And I think that that's the danger of the left playing so hard on this.
Well, and I think from the left standpoint, it's a misfire in terms of plotting and strategy, because look, after the first assassination attempt, all it did was galvanize the Republican base, and then it galvanized people that were on the fringe. They were like, it almost turned Trump into this hero, right? He survived the assassination attempt, and it's like this continual drumbeat of he's Hitler, he's Hitler, he's Hitler. It creates this incendiary piece on the left where they hate this guy so much. But again, when you take it to that extreme, I think it really galvanizes the other side of the aisle, because everybody's like, okay, we don't want to be associated with political violence. Like, that side is crazy.
Yeah. And with, Donald Trump, there's no other era before 2016 where Donald Trump could have been successful running for president. And I think that's a sign of that desperation, where people said, we need a club to wield against the establishment, and the Mitt Romneys aren't going to cut it anymore. Like, I don't care if I think there's a lot of people who say, I don't even care about Donald Trump's policy per se. I don't even care if there's somebody who aligns with me more on policy from a presidential or political standpoint. I need somebody who's going to throw a wrench into the works and just try to break the system almost. Yep. And I think, and there's been such hatred growing where there's a lot of people who will vote for Donald Trump just because they see how much he ticks off the people that they dislike.
Oh, you're 100% right. I mean, I think it's so funny because politics has forever been about policy, right?
Yeah.
We've always had these conversations about privatizing Social Security and the national debt and all these things, and none of that matters today. And it's funny because you see on like left-wing media, you say, well, if Trump just would speak to the policy, he would be doing really well. But on the other hand, they say if Kamala Harris, she doesn't need to speak to policy because nobody cares about that. The truth is, nobody right now cares about the policy.
No.
It's purely this kind of like A team versus B team, and who are you going to root for?
Right. You're totally right. And that's an unfortunate element of what's been creeping into our politics, is the tribalism and this team versus that team, because politics has been that way in the United States for a long time, where it's Republicans versus Democrats. But ultimately, I think what the trouble you get into there is you fail to hold your own side accountable at that point. Because if you're just, I'm team Republican or I'm team Democrat, no matter what, at that point, then if your vote, your support is that baked in, they're not going to make any adjustments to how you want them to perform. And I think that's what's happened with the GOP in many ways, is they know we have your support. You look at the support for incumbents across the board, where Congress has the lowest approval rating out of any political body or any individual in the United States. If you take anything, Congress has the lowest approval year over year over year. But incumbents have a 95% re-election rate. So those two things don't
defies logic.
Yeah, it defies logic, and that's where you get into the whole tribalistic and failing to actually look at policy and look at individuals rather than just looking at a party at large.
And the thing that's funny is, like, you look at guys like a Mitch McConnell. Like,
perfect example.
How does this guy get even when he's being primaried by another Republican? Like, why has that tribalism not at least shift from the Republican that no one likes to, hey, this guy's up and coming and he seems to make a lot of sense. He's logical. He's rational. We like him. We think he can actually do it and affect change in Washington. But Mitch McConnell just gets
it feels like Stockholm syndrome,
Right.
or so it feels like that I've called it Mitch McConnell syndrome before because he's the perfect example. He's one of the least popular politicians in the United States across the spectrum, and Republicans, if he shows up at a Trump rally, he's getting booed. If he shows up at any Republican event, he's getting booed.
They booed him at the convention this year.
Right. But every single Republican primary, he wins in a landslide. So you start to have to ask those questions of how are we factoring in as a population into enabling these people to do what they're doing? Because we can complain about them all we want, but at the end of the day, we're not holding up our end of the bargain because we are the mechanism as the people that is meant to hold these politicians accountable. And I don't think there's any other way to look at it than we've failed at that responsibility. Now, I kind of want to shift it, and we're talking about desperation here. I think desperation is maybe the word of our time right now. But you look at the people in Springfield who are getting more and more desperate, and the people in the small towns. And I'm not even talking about just with the immigration issue, although that's what we're getting into right now. But small town America for our entire lives has been hurting, crumbling, and continuing to deteriorate with really no help. And that's why they turned to somebody like Donald Trump, who finally spoke to them, because nobody did for a long time. But you look at what's going on in Springfield, obviously, maybe the number one thing in the news over the last couple months has been the 20,000 Haitians that were shipped into Springfield, and we're uncovering more and more towns that, you had a town of like 5,000 in Alabama where they brought in 3,000 immigrants. You obviously have cities like Minneapolis where you're now having politicians who are campaigning and their entire campaign events are in Somali. They're not even speaking English at this point. That if you turned it on 10 years ago, if you turned on one, you wouldn't think that was happening in the United States. It just shows how fast things have escalated. But I think what we have a problem actually defining is, why is this bad? Like, why is it bad to import tens of thousands of people into a small town? Because you have people like Mike DeWine here in Ohio, who Mike DeWine is no favorite of the Republican base, but he's a Republican governor. He's what we got right now. And, he came out and kind of defended the situation in Springfield, and he said that these Haitians were very good workers, right? That was kind of his defense of what was going on. And you had Frank Luntz, who, Frank Luntz is the guy who would go on. I don't know if he still works for Fox News.
I've seen him on Fox a little bit, but he's been bouncing around the network.
Yeah. He's the guy who goes out there, and they'd have the focus groups after the presidential debates, and Frank Luntz would go out and say, who thinks Donald Trump won, who thinks Hillary won, and he would kind of have a mini focus group. I mean, I don't know what his value really is brought to the table, but he's always constantly been employed. So there must be something there. But maybe
we're missing something.
Yeah. So he came out and he said, he tweeted about these individuals in Springfield, that these Haitians in Springfield, that they've revitalized the town, that they work in the factories, that they're canning fruit at Dole, and they're paying taxes and spending money at Walmart. That was kind of how he closed out his statement. And for me, what I've realized for a long time, the problem with the conservative and Republican view on things has kind of always been, we've looked at everything, every policy from the standpoint of GDP, of how can we grow specifically tax revenue. That's how a lot of Republican politicians have looked at everything, of every move that is made, how does this impact dollars and cents? But we can't look at every issue from the standpoint of, how does this affect our tax revenue? How does this impact our GDP? We actually have to think about the people who are involved in this, because why are we looking at this as a collective situation and saying it's good to have Haitians come in because they're increasing tax revenue? But the conversation isn't, how does this impact the native residents of that town? Are they of no consideration in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the population of Springfield was roughly like 30,000 or so.
Yeah.
And then you bring in 20,000. So you've almost doubled the population overnight in the area. It puts a strain on everything.
Right.
I mean, even just basic government services. I've seen a lot of stories of where people were waiting for months and months to get unemployment or food stamps or whatever the case may be, whatever that's the safety net structure that they were trying to be a part of. But it's so overrun because the entire infrastructure of the town is trying to figure out, how do we operate in this new normal? And then you also have just the impact on culture itself.
Yeah.
I mean, these people come from a different place, speak different languages. They don't have necessarily all the same values, and it's like, what does that do to a small town that's never seen anything like this before?
Right, and I think it's frustrating because we're constantly told that we're not allowed to prefer anything, right? As people who are native to our country, native to our communities, we're always told we're not allowed to prefer anything, where we're not allowed to say, I want my community to be like this. I want my community to share values that share my values. I want my community to share a language. I want my community to share a heritage. You're not allowed, and for all of human history, we were allowed to think that way. For all of human history, we knew that that was actually how you created strong communities, by the things you share. Now we talk about all the things you hear all the time, obviously from the Democrat platform, that diversity is our strength. Diversity is our strength. When in reality, what makes a nation strong, what makes a community strong, is what you share. That can happen among a diverse population, but ultimately you need to share something to have a coherent society. So as we're looking at Springfield specifically, Mike DeWine just announced within the last couple of days that they're sending $1.3 million to Springfield. They sent in the National Guard and different resources to handle with this. They've done everything but say, hey, maybe we shouldn't have shipped 20,000 people into the small town.
This was a mistake.
But a huge portion of that, it's going back to the government. It's essentially this big money laundering scheme where things are just circulating around. You actually have money going towards giving these Haitians driving lessons, right? Because you had an 11-year-old boy that was killed in Springfield by one of these Haitian immigrants. Yeah. And I guess the frustration that so many of us have is you have people throughout this country. It's not just happening in Springfield. But if you think about it from a big picture standpoint, when you have in this country, you have anywhere, there's a million different estimates on how many illegal immigrants are here, right? Some people will say 10 million, some people will say up to 30 million. The numbers, it's really hard to say specifically. But we also have millions and millions of legal immigrants here who are coming here very quickly at a rate that we've never seen before in human history. What's happening in the United States is the largest migration of people in the history of the world. But the conversation that we don't have is, we talk about housing prices and people having difficulty having a home, but we never actually talk about the fact that you're competing with 30 million extra people in this country for a home now. You're competing with 30 million extra people for groceries now. You don't think that's going to hurt you as an individual? You don't think that's going to hurt you when you go to the store and you're fighting 30 million extra people for food or to put a roof over your head? And that's the frustration that people are now having, is we want to be a welcoming country. We want to be a country that treats people the right way. But as soon as our quality of life starts deteriorating in front of us, that's where people get upset, and that's where you start seeing, I think, the backlash that's happening now. And Trump made a great point at one of his rallies in PA, and I'm always somebody that's saying, Trump needs to get a little bit stronger on some of his rhetoric. So I'm not somebody that's going to come out and always defend everything he says or does. But he made these comments at the PA rally, and you alluded to this earlier, but he said, it takes hundreds of years to build a culture in these communities, in a state, in a nation. And what's happening is these people are coming in and destroying it in an instant. Right. And that's sad, right? We should be allowed to have a culture of our own. We should be allowed to have a nation of our own, and we should be allowed to dictate the terms of how you come into our communities and how you come into our nation. And I think that's the fight that we're having right now is, do we view ourselves as a country or not?
Yeah. And you know what? I think that a huge problem right now is, obviously we've shined this spotlight on Springfield, Ohio. But we kicked it off with the wrong conversation, right? I mean, we kicked it off with the national news of they're eating the pets and that.
Yeah.
So this is the real conversation, right?
Yeah.
It's about culture, about people, and your opportunity in life. Like, that is enough of an argument to bring this up. But we started, talking about the pets, and it's a huge distraction to the real issue. So we weren't even having that conversation because everybody's so focused on what came out first.
Yeah, I think that's almost, without putting terms on it, that's people that are identifying with, we have a culture, they have a different culture. Because if you look at Haiti as a nation, independent of us, Haiti, recently in the news, we're just all over the news where you had cannibal gangs roaming the street, eating people on the streets, right? We know in Haiti they do eat cats and dogs, and it's been one of the most, if not the most unstable governments and nations in world history, right? It's really just a place that cannot get its act together. So I think what people are seeing is, and actually the Trump campaign tweeted this out, like, you import the third world, you become the third world. And that's a hard thing to swallow from a standpoint of, myself as the person that I am, where you want to welcome everybody and treat everybody exactly the same. But you have to understand that there are differences between people and cultures, and that matters when you import huge amounts of people, especially into a small town.
And that's the problem, is it's a mean politicking, right?
Yeah.
It's stuff no one wants to talk about. But you can't just ignore. If you ignore it, you have what's going on in Springfield today.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the outcome.
Yeah, and I think when everything that we're talking about now as far as policy, it's difficult because we're going to have a lot of difficult conversations about how this is going to get fixed, because there was a point in time where immigration could have just been solved by closing the border.
Sure.
Right? But we failed to do that for decades.
My entire life, basically.
Yeah, and now we're in the situation where even if you close the border, that's not going to solve the problem. You're still going to have to deport millions of people. You're still going to have to deal with legal immigration and the flow of people that are coming in that way. So the further we kick the can down the road, now the actual solutions to these problems are going to be more and more harsh, which is unfortunate, because as human beings, we don't want to have to carry out harsh things, but that's increasingly becoming our reality.
Yeah, and I think that's where the conversation gets very difficult, because the option you're left with, which is a policy component of Donald Trump's platform, is mass deportation.
Yeah,
which again is ugly in its nature. I mean, we don't want, as Americans, want to think about a SWAT team or police showing up at someone's house, pulling them out and making them leave.
Right.
Like, that's not. But then how else do you solve 30 million people that are here illegally?
You don't. So that's really the question that we have to answer, and we're going to have to answer, and is, do we have the stomach for that? Right? As Americans, do we have the stomach for that? Because if Donald Trump holds up his promises and they go through this mass deportation that in my opinion has to happen, the first thing you're going to see when you turn on CNN, when you turn on MSNBC, when you turn on any news, you're going to see that child being separated from their mom, crying on national television, and those are going to be the difficult moments that happen. Now, I will say that a huge percentage of illegal immigrants in this country that have come over are fighting age single males. That we always get the picture painted to us of the child and the mother, but in reality, we're getting the majority of people that are coming through are working age single males. So we have to face this reality of, we have difficult questions in front of us, and they're going to be difficult answers. And I think that's a great segue into talking about this next subject of, again, difficult things that I think we've forgotten as a people, how a society is kept together, that it's kept together by difficult decisions, not just all sunshine and rainbows, because we lived in such a time. Everybody alive today in the United States has experienced peace and prosperity like nobody else in human history.
Yep.
So we don't actually understand what it takes to maintain those things. And there's times harsh decisions that need to be made. So one of the harsh things going on from the standpoint of the injustice that's taking place in the United States is, there's two stories that I think really draw a stark contrast between the two-tiered justice system that we're living under, and why Americans continually feel more desperate for somebody to solve it. You had this guy, Daniel Penny, in New York City, who, if you heard the news at that time, he was on the subway and there was this lunatic, he's on drugs, he was a homeless man, he was on the subway, and he was talking about killing people on the subway. And he was somebody who had been on the subway a number of times, and people knew him as this kind of druggie that was on the subway. So there were men, women, and children on this subway, and this guy started making, this lunatic started making threats. And what happened was Daniel Penny choked this guy out, essentially put him in a submission move, and the guy wound up, this homeless man wound up dying. Daniel Penny is facing life in prison in New York City for defending women and children on this subway and defending them against threats from somebody who was obviously mentally ill. What you have going on, compare this to what you have going on right here, not far from my home in North Olmsted, Ohio. This woman, Bianca Ellis, who stabbed a 3-year-old child to death outside of a grocery store, stabbed the child's mother and killed this 3-year-old. She was on video that went viral on social media because the charges were being read and the description of what happened was being read, and she was smiling at the camera. Obviously, whether you have children or not, it just makes your stomach turn to see that type of evil truly on display. Bianca Ellis is not facing any time in prison or the death penalty or anything right now. She is being sent to get treatment, medical treatment from doctors because she was deemed unfit to stand trial. Now, what is happening here? Because you have a person who defended women and children on a subway, and you have a person who stabbed a 3-year-old to death. And one of those people is facing life in prison. The other person is receiving medical treatment. Now, in a sane society, what would happen is you'd have Daniel Penny probably be given the key to the city and being given a reward for defending people in public. And you'd have Bianca Ellis probably publicly executed for killing a 3-year-old child, stabbing a 3-year-old child to death. So what is the ultimate goal here is kind of my question and my thought process of, you have this 2-tier justice system. Why are they doing this to us? Why is this happening?
Yeah, look, I find these situations to be difficult in general. Anytime there's legal battles and these get politicized so instantly by race. And I find both stories incredibly sad, honestly. I mean, if you look at the victim in the Daniel Penny case, who passed away. I mean, this was somebody, I think his mom was murdered when he was 14 years old, cut up into pieces and put into a suitcase on the side of the road. And from there, just like the gradual decline of his mental instability. He was known, on the New York rolls as somebody that had been in and out of homeless shelters, they've tried to help but couldn't, was refusing treatment, those sorts of things, and was a high-risk individual. And obviously, he got on that subway that day and was making threats. Said, I don't care if I die. I will kill someone. I don't care if I spend life in jail. Was making intimidating gestures towards people on the subway. And Daniel Penny did at the time what I think a lot of people would do if put in that situation, which is try to subdue the person that was intimidating others and causing panic. Again, I'm not the jury here or the judge. I think that this honestly comes down to what they're going to decide based on how long he kind of had the chokehold in place. Like, that seems to be the crux of like the legal issue, right?
Yeah.
They're saying he should have let go earlier. But I think it's hard. It's almost that same conversation you have about police every time that there's a shooting with a minority victim, right? That in the moment, you have a guy that is struggling to get free. You have 2 or 3 other individuals that are helping hold this gentleman down while you are essentially subduing him. And it's not as easy as like understanding like, okay, like if I get off this guy now, is he going to be cool? Is he truly out of it? And that's where the jury's going to have to decide. And on the Bianca Ellis side, I mean, just an incredibly just insane story. I was just thinking about my own son last night, like we were kind of thinking, prepping for today, and it just hit me in a whole bunch of different ways. I mean, this woman walked out of a grocery store in her hometown, and for no reason, essentially, they're calling this a random act of violence. For no reason, stabbed the child and the mother who was trying to save the child. I just don't know that, like, are there winners? Like, to me, both stories are just incredibly sad. And it's hard to, like, we have to remember that we don't really have a justice system in this country. We have a legal system. And sometimes that leaves, there just really aren't winners and losers in these. So I always want to kind of keep an arm's distance from these before we turn people into victims or heroes on these, and understanding that I'm not a voice in that jury. So I think it's going to be a tough decision either way. But again, I think you put any of us in that situation that Daniel Penny was in, understanding we're trying to help the general public. And it's, again, very much like the cop-related shootings that we see where it's in that moment. What do you do? How do you handle yourself when you're trying to protect others?
Well, I think what's at the crux of this, you made a point about the history of the individual that Daniel Penny choked out on the subway, about what had gone on in his life, right? And the question really about the justice system or the legal system is not really how much it's about delivering. The goal is to deliver justice, right? What does this crime deserve from a justice act standpoint? What do the victims of this crime deserve? But it's also, how do we prevent this in the future, right? And I think when you look at both Bianca Ellis and the individual that was killed on the subway, they were both individuals that would have benefited greatly from the system that we once had in place with mental institutions in this country. Because if you look at the sharp closing of mental institutions in the United States, and I think I think we should bring them back, and I think they should be very closely monitored, obviously, because things can go wrong. But if you look at the sharp decline in mental institutions, it's followed by an extremely sharp uptick in crime and mental illness in the United States. And the reason is we're just allowing these people to roam the streets, and it's not so much that we want to give empathy and sympathy to so many of these people and say, well, they shouldn't be locked up, they shouldn't be this, they shouldn't be that. But at the end of the day, if they're a threat to others or themselves, which both of these people are, the only other option is to get them help before this happens. So the justice system is in place, should be in place, the legal system should be in place, that when these things happen, right, justice is served. But we don't have a system in place right now that is preventative in any way to really get these people off the streets. Because you look at New York City, I mean, you look at Cleveland, you walk through the streets of Cleveland, there are people who would benefit greatly from having a system in place where they could get some help. And whether it's being taken against their will, it's better than them freezing on the streets of Cleveland, sure, right, in the middle of January.
I think that's the one thing that's definitely clear in both cases, is that the current system failed both of these individuals,
yeah,
and put them in a position where this is their life. These are the decisions that they made.
Yeah, and I think to put a cap on this, what I think is going on with these two situations, and the reason I bring them up is because I believe they represent the situation very clearly, is you have a system in the United States, you have a establishment, whatever you want to call it, the swamp, whoever is manipulating, controlling things, however you want to illustrate that, their goal ultimately is to make you dependent upon them, is to make you stuck and to make you scared. So how do you do that? Ultimately, you make people afraid of the streets, afraid of their communities, afraid to go outside and operate independently, right? That's what's going on with the rise in crime that we're seeing. And they'll tell you, the FBI is going to tell you, oh, there's actually a decrease in crime. We're just not reporting from New York City or LA or any of the major crime centers in the country. Funny how that works. But at the same time of filling our streets with criminals and with madmen and with everything that's going on, you are increasingly unable to defend yourself. You're increasingly unable to practice self-defense, and for you and your family. So you're stuck between a place where you have folks attacking you on the street end, right? Criminals, people who with mental illnesses, and then you have the justice system that is going to separate you from your family if you just dare to defend yourself. And that's really what's scary about what's going on, because it feels like just regular people, and I'm not talking about people who are as political as I am, who are as gung-ho as I am. Regular people are getting squeezed and scared to the point where you're starting to feel paralyzed.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. I have that thought a lot. It's just about my own home and protecting my own family. It's like it almost makes that decision hard, because you're afraid of the consequences of protecting yourself and your family.
Yeah, and that should never be the case, because criminals know this too, right? The more people are afraid to defend themselves, the more that criminals know that they can get away with. You see what just happened in Cleveland over the weekend, where you had these gangs roaming around, blocking traffic, knocking on windows, wearing masks, just to terrorize people. And you're like, where are the police? Where are people getting handcuffed and getting thrown in the back of paddy wagons? Because innocent people are just being terrorized, right? Men, women, and children. And this is not the nation or the society that you or I were born into. This happened really, really fast.
This street gang thing is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to blow up the topic and go into another tangent here, but it's now it's here in Cleveland. Like it started in like Philadelphia, Chicago, like some of these bigger cities, but like it's here now. And it's absolutely terrifying. I mean, these people, some of the people that were caught up in this were just people that were like out for the night on the town, having like a birthday party and like a party bus.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, like it's surrounded by a mob of people that are busting out windows and shouting at them and throwing rocks. And it's taking. I know the one guy called the police and he got an answering machine. It's like,
yeah, it's. I mean,
what are you supposed to do?
It's bad. And in Cleveland, you know, when I lived in Cleveland, this just happened a couple years ago. I lived on the street. At the corner of the street, I had this homeless man come out. He's throwing his shoes in the street, rips his shirt off. He's just yelling and screaming. Obviously, he's probably very high on something, very, mentally ill. But I called the police. They never showed up. And so you look at this person and you say, this is a person that really needs help, because if he doesn't hurt somebody else, he's going to hurt himself. Yeah. He's probably actively hurting himself by what he's doing. And I'm not blaming the police for this, because I mean, I know in the city of Cleveland, I know around the country, these police officers are handcuffed by what they're able to do, and they're extremely understaffed. So they're spread out all over the place. They have to really prioritize what they're going to do, and the sentencing on people is getting less and less, to the point where people are just walking into a courthouse and walking out with nothing happening to them. They're just back on the street doing the same thing. So you start to get demoralized as a citizen living in these areas.
Well, and then these issues are compounded then by like things like illegal immigration. And
yeah.
Then there's just this continual cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so shifting gears here into our last subject here. This is a story that is insane, but is not surprising whatsoever if you paid attention to anything that was going on during COVID. So, great article by NBC News. Former New York City COVID czar admitted he held private gatherings during the height of the pandemic. What these private gatherings, you might ask? Dr. Jay Varma admitted to taking part in a sex party and a dance bash on Wall Street while the city was in a pandemic lockdown. He went on to say that he had maybe had some poor judgment in there, which puts it pretty lightly. I mean, this is maybe perfectly illustrates what happened during COVID and what was done to the people of this country. Because this guy, it's funny because it reminds me of in Batman, in the third movie of the trilogy, when it's the opening scene with Bane, and he sends out one of his henchmen that has to stay in the plane that crashes. They expect one of us in the wreckage. That's what this guy feels like to me. Because you had people like Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, who was out partying. You had Gavin Newsom in California out partying. You had the San Francisco mayor. You had countless public officials during COVID, in the heights of it, that were out eating and drinking, flying all over the place, breaking every rule that they put in place for the little peons like you and I. And then you have people like this out having literal sex parties while we were told you can't open your business, you can't go to church, you can't even step outside your door without a mask on. You can't do your entire traditions, your norms, your way of life is now ruined, but I'm going to go ahead to a sex party.
We had one-way aisles in the supermarket.
Yeah, you can't walk down the aisle in the same direction as the person next to you, but I'm going to go have a sex party because that's how dangerous COVID is. And that's really what was jarring to me this entire time, and what told me a lot about what was happening during COVID. Now, I know people lost people. I know it was a traumatizing time for a lot of people. But what I saw from the public health officials, the public political officials, the media officials, is that none of them actually took it seriously. So that's really what told a lot to me during COVID was, why am I taking this seriously when our public officials clearly do not take it seriously? They only take it seriously when it comes to putting their boot on our face. So you saw the videos where you'd have you had the public health officials who you'd see them behind the door and they'd put on their mask right before they got on camera and then take it off again. So it was all this show. It was all this charade. And these people, it's so frustrating. It makes me very angry, honestly, that how shameless these people are, how despicable they are, because they are literally responsible. These people that were out having sex parties, they're literally responsible for kids killing themselves. They're responsible for people overdosing. They're responsible for countless businesses being shut down, people's livelihoods, people being thrown into poverty. They're responsible for kids who are years behind in the classroom, who didn't develop properly in a social aspect. They're responsible for some really horrendous outcomes of what happened. And none of them, for the most part, are being held accountable. And that's really what's frustrating to me, is the same people who destroyed your business and went out and had a sex party are the same people, for the most part, who are still in their same positions today, being paid just an obscene amount of money.
Yeah. Well, we always knew COVID wasn't sexually transmitted, but but no, I mean, I think, how about, you had a really good list there, but how about people that just lost loved ones and weren't able to say goodbye to them because they couldn't even go into a hospital, or missed the birth of a child because they couldn't be in the same room as their spouse. To me, this story in particular is almost kind of representative of politics writ large, right? It's do as I say, not as I do, and nothing illustrated that better than COVID and the response to COVID from these politicians, because it was very much a show where it was almost like a teacher in a classroom, right? Like you want to be a good role model for the students, so you make sure you use proper language and you use proper mannerisms and you don't do anything unseemly. But then you go back to the teacher's lounge and you pop up a smoke and you're cussing and drinking or whatever. It's a whole different. It's just they're treating us like children. And they're trying to put this face forward of this is how everybody should act, and if everybody does this, everybody's safe. But behind the scenes, we're still going to do what we want.
It's Animal Farm, right? It's every animal is equal, except other animals are more equal than others, right? That's it. Nothing illustrates that better than what's going on. And I think I've talked before about, I can't even imagine. We had times in our history in the United States, we have a very rich history of kind of heroes in our politics. This podcast, after Teddy Roosevelt, you look at somebody who, just the coolest person probably who ever lived in Teddy Roosevelt. You look at somebody, obviously president, vice president, being an assemblyman in New York, being a police chief, but leading the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, boxing people while he was president, almost dying in the Amazon. Just an amazing human being. And you look at our politicians today, that the way they treat us and the way they behave, and they're you look at the pictures from even January 6th and what on, and those congressmen that they're cowering in the aisles of in Congress and everything, and you just think, these are the people that are chosen to lead us. These are the people, and I think that ultimately what it comes down to, and I think where we have to hold ourselves to account in many ways as a people, is whether we like it or not, in our system of government, the government is a reflection of us. And so you looked at somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, you look at people like Thomas Jefferson, you look at George Washington, you look at Abraham Lincoln. I would love for that to be our reflection. But right now, our reflection are people like Kamala Harris, like Joe Biden, like this COVID czar in New York City having sex parties, right? He wasn't elected, but he was put there by somebody who was. So I think we have to start saying, what are we doing to enable this? What are we doing to allow this to take place? Because COVID, I felt, my hope in COVID really was, this is going to wake so many people up, because never before have more civil liberties been taken away from the American people at once without any kind of approval from us. But what happened? The same people, and I'll focus on the Republican side, the same people who imposed the harshest lockdowns, who took away your business, who didn't let you see your dying grandmother, made your mom or dad die alone. These people didn't let you go to church. These people were elected most of the time in their re-elected in their primaries by landslides, and most of the time. And so it was one of those kind of facepalm moments for me of, what are we doing here? What are we really complaining about? Where we can talk about the left and the Democrats and how terrible they are all day long, but the same people on our side, supposedly our side, who followed the exact guidelines that Fauci did, we are still 100% in support of in many cases. And that, to me, is very illustrative of the problem that is really plaguing us as a nation.
Well, I think that's the real pandemic, is that people don't care about accountability. We say it, we talk a big game, but we don't ever hold anyone accountable.
No.
And that's really a shame. And I don't know if it's just that so many people have tuned out of American politics. They just don't care. They just don't think that, it impacts their lives. Whether or not that's true or not, like, they don't care. They're just going, I can't change it. I can't fix it. I feel helpless. How would I hold someone accountable? That they just are at a complete point of apathy.
Yeah.
And that's really the shame, because to your point, like the politics should be a reflection of its people, and it's increasingly becoming not a reflection of anything recognizable.
Yeah. No, it's like the picture of Dorian Gray, and it's something that it's getting to be a very ugly reflection. And I think ultimately we have to have kind of a come to Jesus moment as a nation of, okay, we screwed up. We enabled this. We are continuing to enable it. How do we now turn the switch on? Because I think, like I've said a couple times during this show, the peace and prosperity that we've lived in, we haven't had to hold people accountable because we've continuously had all of our needs met, and we've lived in a type of luxury that no humans ever have before. So my fear in all of this is that we're going to get to a point that's going to get very ugly before enough people wake up to really make a difference. And then at that point, is it going to be too late to come back? That's really the big question on my mind.
But it's like, how much uglier can it get than COVID? Like, to your point, that
Exactly,
should have woken people up.
Right. Yeah.
And it still didn't.
Right. And that was what was so baffling to me. And I think ultimately, we've shown ourselves at large as a society that as long as we have a roof over our head, food in our belly, and something stupid to watch on TV, most people, or an increasing number of people in our population, are okay with that being their lives. And for people like us, it's not. That's not living. Our lives are supposed to be like that of Teddy Roosevelt, of adventure, of working towards more, of just unbridled enthusiasm and search for something greater. And that's unfortunately what we've lost as that American spirit that once drove us. Because if we all had that still in us, there's no way that people would have tolerated being stuck at home watching Netflix for months at a time.
Yeah, I mean, Manifest Destiny is it's a footnote in history.
Yeah, right. And I think those are ultimately the same things that we need to inspire today if we're going to have any hope to move forward. So that's our calibration for today. Thanks a lot, Ken.
Happy to be here.
We're going to close today with our uncomfortable truth. And this one is something that I really take no pleasure in talking about. It's something that I wish was different. And that's going to be the typical tone of this segment is we're going to talk about something that I wish weren't the case, but it is really becoming the case. There's this article recently that came out on The Blaze where 3 out of 10 Democrats responded to a poll preferring that Donald Trump would have been killed in the assassination attempt. 3 out of 10 Democrats essentially answered in this poll that they would have rather had that bullet pierce Donald Trump's brain on national television in front of men, women, and children. This is one poll, take it as you will, but this is a growing trend among the Democrat voting base that I find very disturbing. And if you're listening to this show, however you politically identify, whether you're somebody like me, I consider myself a constitutional conservative, but an independent. I don't like the Republican Party. I don't like the Democrat Party. You might consider yourself a regular run-of-the-mill Republican, a moderate. You might even lean left. But the reality here is there is a hostility growing among the Democrat voting base towards anyone who doesn't fall in line. You saw during COVID, and we just talked about this last segment, about what happened during COVID to so many people. And we like to harp so much on the Democrat politicians because they're an easy target, right? They're in the spotlight. They have a target on their back. They open themselves up to criticism. But we have a harder time actually moving down the ranks to the people who actually vote when it comes to the Democrat Party. But you look during COVID, polling shows that half of Democrats wanted individuals who didn't get the experimental vaccination, COVID vaccination, thrown into a camp. 25% wanted the non-vaccinated the children of non-vaccinated individuals taken away from them. And you look at the same polling done by the same firms, you have 3/4 of Democrats that want hate speech laws, that want restrictions on speech that they don't find appropriate. So there's a growing trend among the Democrat voting base that is getting more and more extreme, more and hostile towards people like you and I. So the question we have to ask, is this a group of people that can be reconciled with? Can we bring them over to our side? Can we make peace with them? Because you look at somebody like Donald Trump, and he's a controversial figure. People love him. People hate him. Democrats specifically can't stand the guy. But like we said earlier in the show, he's not Hitler. He's not a threat to democracy. He's a pretty moderate guy on most issues. So does this end with Donald Trump? If this poll is accurate, and 3 out of 10 Democrats wish Donald Trump had been killed in the assassination attempt, if that poll is accurate, the number is probably a little bit higher if you think about people who think to themselves, I better probably not answer yes to this question because that would make me a pretty bad person, right? So anything is going to probably be a little bit higher than what's actually there. But does this attitude end with Donald Trump? Or does it end with a congressman? Does it end with a governor? Or does it trickle down to anybody who becomes a legitimate threat to their goals, to their political goals, to their goals for our way of life? Do you think that this feeling of hatred towards Donald Trump doesn't apply to you, doesn't apply to me, doesn't apply to somebody who thinks differently than they do? Because ultimately, if you can paint somebody like Donald Trump, who's a moderate on most issues, as a threat to democracy, as somebody who ought to be killed, then that's going to trickle down. Can you reason with a group who thinks this way? That's ultimately the question and the truth that we have to find. Because we can spend all of our time and energy on the battlefield of ideas and healthy debate, and all those things are great. But at the end of the day, if there's a political group and a political trend growing in the United States of people who want you dead, that is not going to end pretty. And that is not a group of people that we're going to be able to reason with. So my message today is anybody that you know, anybody that you feel is reachable, reach out to them. We treat everybody with love, with respect, with honesty, and always engage in healthy conversation. But don't beat your head against the wall with 3 out of 10 Democrats who wanted Trump dead. At the end of the day, we are fighting a war. America is at war. We are in a cold civil war here in the United States. We're at war abroad. We're seeing what's going on in Israel and Ukraine, and all of our billions of tax dollars being sent everywhere, but like North Carolina, where we're having actual Americans suffering due to the natural disasters. But we are at war here with ourselves, and it's going to get very ugly very quickly if something is not done. One way or another at this election, at the end of this election cycle, we're going to have to make some really difficult decisions about who we are as a people. What is our culture? What is our way of life? What do we want our communities to look like? And ultimately, we have to make that decision that we are going to be like our ancestors, be like our founding fathers, and make those harsh decisions that are going to save our children and grandchildren from that life of servitude. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Jonah Schultz. This is Man in the Arena.
If I can change, я думаю, что каждый тоже изменился. And you can change. Вы можете измениться. Everybody can change.